Hi everybody, Jennifer Schaus here, coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us in our FAR Supplement webinar series. These webinars are every Wednesday. They are recorded. They start at 12 o'clock. You can usually find the recordings on our website and also on our YouTube channel. Speaking of webinars, we've got over 500 right now on our YouTube channel. We've got sponsorships available. If you're searching for any webinars, the best way to do it is to navigate to our website, click on the tab called Webinars, and they are all segmented by topic. For today's webinars, there's a section on the website called FAR Supplements, and then on the corresponding Fridays, we do a Playbook series. You probably found out about today's webinar through our newsletter, which reaches over 23,000 federal contractors, or mostly federal contractors, and we have advertising options available there. You can send us an email if you're interested in any of those. Quick blurb about us: we are based in downtown DC and provide professional services, non-legal professional services for government contractors who are established and selling products, services, or software. The main service that we do provide is helping with GSA schedules and some other services that you can see here on the screen. Again, about this supplement series, it's every Wednesday at 12, as I mentioned. Our speakers are subject matter experts, some accountants, and government contracts attorneys. Here's the schedule for the Wednesday series, which takes us through the end of August to the end of the summer. As you can see today, we're covering the Air Force. Next week, we get into DISA and DLA. And then what happens on Fridays is the corresponding playbook. So this Friday, we'll be doing business with the Air Force. We'll have a couple panelists who will be speaking about business opportunities, contracting trends, merger and acquisition trends, and activity happening within the top vendors within the Air Force. All of those links, we sent out an email today that I think had a faulty link for the Fridays. All you need to do is go to our website and click on the section called Playbooks, scroll down to the Air Force, click on that to register for the webinar. Those are also complimentary. And we want to thank our sponsors. First up is the Virginia Ptac. They are the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, co-located at the George Mason University over in Virginia, in Fairfax, and they've got a variety of services for burgeoning government contractors. So they offer one-on-one counseling and training. They also offer classes. If you go to their website, you can navigate to their calendar or sign up for a counseling session. You've got a phone number and email address as well if you need additional assistance. So we want to thank the Virginia Ptac for their support of this series. We also want to thank the Federal Business Council. They are premier agency for putting on government contracting events at various agencies, and they also host the annual procurement fair, which I believe is usually in April. I'm not sure what the schedule is this year for them. If you go to their website, or you've got a phone number as well as an email address there, you can get additional information. Our other sponsor here is Gov White Papers, which spun out of Carrie Ray's Gov events. Gov White Papers is the spot to go to find content, post content, and promote content. This is a great resource for both government contractors as well as government. All sorts of just great white papers and content there that you can search on, including cybersecurity, CMMC, COVID, AI, and other hot topics in government contracting. I don't think we have a phone number on this slide, but you've got an email here in the lower right-hand corner, which is hello@govwhitepapers.com. Highly encourage you guys to go there. They do have that is a great resource. Okay, and so today the reason that we're here is to cover the FAR supplement on the Air Force. And I will be quiet now and turn the floor over to Nicole Potroff. And Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us, Jennifer. As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Nicole Potroff. I'm an equity partner at Co-Prince Nicole Potroff. We are a boutique law firm. We are located in Lawrence, Kansas. We do strictly federal government contracting. So while that is actually quite a broad area of practice, everything from SBA, GAO protests to negotiating subcontracts and drafting joint ventures and all of those things, it is also very niche, and we prefer it that way so we can really gain our expertise in this area of law. And the FAR is one of our, go-to areas of regulations, and the AFARs today, what we're going to be talking about is not something we work a ton with, but it is something we're very familiar with and have had to go to at certain times, and we will go into lots of details here with you on that. And I did want to really quick mention, we also have our blog, which is the smallgovcon.com blog. And there's a lot of great information on there for agencies, federal government contractors. We've even had Ptacs reach out to us. We've had SBA representatives reach out to us. So it's just a great place for updates and what's going on in the industry and in the federal contracting world. So check it out.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole. And her co-presenter here is Kevin Wycliffe. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll be quiet and let you speak.
Thank you. I'm of counsel with Procurements, and like Nicole said, we specialize in government contracting, and we're happy to be here today to talk about this FARs with you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm gonna move on and mute myself, and you guys just let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to call it the AFARs. That's what we've always called it, but it's the AFFARS, and that is the Air Force Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. I'm sure if you're all here today, you are well aware that that is what it stands for. But essentially, this is the Air Force's additional rules for procurement. And I say additional because it does not take the place of the FARs and the DFARS, the Department of Defense area of the FARs. It is a supplement to those. So it is in addition to the rules, the requirements, and the standards you will find in those areas. This one is codified under FAR Chapter 53. And again, as I said, it is in addition to those things. And in fact, the Air Force does make deviations from the FAR and even from the AFARS itself, even though that is their own regulations, in accordance with the DFARS permission to do so. So even once you've looked at the FARs, the DFARS, and the AFARs, always make sure there's not a deviation out there for, limitation on subcontracting. There was one of those for a long time. Just making sure that you cover the full range of what your contract may be subject to as an AFARS contractor. So much of the AFARs that we're going to talk about here is actually for the Air Force officials, not necessarily directed to the contractors. But why does that pertain to, contractors? Well, it is important to know how things work and what's going on. And if there is any kind of question as to how a contract is being carried out or how the agency is behaving, it's important to go look at those and know whether you have a potential basis to protest, you have some questions for the agency, or you simply want to know, what your rights are and potential recoveries, extra costs. All of those can be really important reasons to go make sure you are familiar with this body of law. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, I covered a little bit of this, but FAR, DFARS, and AFARS. So FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulations, DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations Supplement. This is all DoD contracts. And then the AFARS, this is specific to the Air Force and governs the Air Force contracts on top of the FAR and DFARS. So we put a little, beautiful Russian doll set here. This is the nesting egg doll approach. This is exactly how these work. You have the larger supplement being the FAR, or the larger body of laws, the FAR all the way on the left, and then you have the supplements as you go, the DFARS being a section of that, and the AFARS being a section of that. Go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to start with part 5306. So we don't cover every single part of the AFARS. We really cover the ones that we found to be the most important for contractors to be familiar with, the ones that had, the good juicy content in them, and that's what we're going to go through here. So again, this is more about what the agencies and officials do. This section specifically is very directed at the officials and the agencies themselves. So the AFARS competition requirements are here, and they mostly outline which officials have the authority to make justifications for things like other other than full and open competition, and how that is done. As you're aware, under CICA, there's a strong preference for doing things with full and open competition and increasing competition, as that's the best thing for everyone involved to have good, healthy competition. This is the rules and regulations for how the agencies can avoid those in situations where they need to make quicker, quicker decisions or easier decisions, or not follow all the steps here. This can be things like bridge actions for certain services contracts, international agreement, competitive restrictions, or the IACR. Unusual and compelling urgency, things like, I don't know, a national pandemic or a global pandemic, where you would jump in and remove some of the requirements to get things done quickly. And things like when there's only one responsible source or no other services and supplies can satisfy the agency needs. So the AFARS also designates the Air Force competition advocates. Their duties are to develop the acquisition strategies, identify, any hurdles for the competition, and to act as the competition and commercial representative for contractor complaints. So this is a list of kind of like sub-agencies that do these things and have the authority and responsibilities to really carry out the competition and ensure the agency's needs are met. There's a lot of useful information in the AFARS in this section. One thing it's important to know, addresses and contact info for divisions must be displayed on a poster in each unit. So if you were looking for those, you could go to the AFARS to figure out where those are going to be found. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is AFARS parts 5309 through 5312. 5309 discusses contractor qualifications. One thing I found somewhat interesting is the Air Force uses a robotic process automation bot to determine prospective contractor responsibility. Responsibility is typically kind of a pass-fail decision. So in a lot of procurements, you will see this kind of pass-fail responsibility section, and then you'll get into the merits of the proposal or bid, the evaluation process that actually weighs the strengths and weaknesses and things like that in most types of acquisitions. And this one kind of runs through the, are you on a list of barred contractors? Have you had any default terminations, things like that. And it's interesting that they do that robotically, but also important that you double check those things and make sure you haven't been eliminated for something, improperly. Part 5310 briefly addresses the market research for agencies. Basically, the responsibilities, the things the agency has to go look at when it says, hey, we did our thorough market research here, and we have determined, kind of as we talked about the last slide, that there's only one responsible source here. And often they have to prove that, especially if that's challenged by a offeror. So this explains the process that needs to be followed, and it would be a great go-to for somebody making an argument, addressing the agency or potentially filing a protest that the market research wasn't done correctly. 5311 explains how the Air Force agencies should describe their requirements. So what are the agency's needs? How do they use and maintain these requirements? That's what you're going to find there. 5312 goes over the acquisition of commercial items. This is special solicitation provisions, terms, and conditions that apply specifically to commercial item acquisitions. And again, these parts really concern the contracting officers and the officials, not the offerers, but I've already given a few examples as to why it's still important as an offerer to be aware of these rules and what is in them. We'll go to the next slide. All right, this is part 5313. So this concerns the simplified acquisition procedures. And again, we talked about those a little bit, but those are going to be things that are under either the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently $250,000 for most acquisitions, and the micro purchase threshold, even smaller than that, which would be $10,000 right now for most acquisitions. So procedures that aren't quite as detailed, quite as extensive. There's not quite as many responsibilities for the Air Force to follow because they're not quite as big of contracts, and they can often kind of bypass some of the full and open competition requirements that are that the larger competitions are going to be subject to. So this is purchase guidelines, and one of the important things here is if you do have a government-wide commercial purchase card, a GPC, the guidelines are here for the use of that card with Air Force contracts. Let's go to the next slide. All right, 5314 and 5315. 5314 concerns the sealed bidding requirements for contracting officials. So I always find the sealed bidding a little bit of kind of a funny term to be using in modern times, because web applications now really do it's like an electronic version of the sealed bidding process. It used to actually be you seal your bid in an envelope and it's not opened until a certain time. But now this is more of a bidders submit bids and attach documents through a login process, and then they agree to an I accept button and things like that. That's the newer sealed bidding process. But how all of that works is present in 5314. And then 5315 concerns the contracting by negotiation. This tends to be a bit more common in my experience, but these are the mandatory procedures, and there's actually a kind of a supplement to this, which is the mandatory procedure MP section, and there's one specific section I want to talk about, which is 5315.3, because that establishes the supplemental procedures for conducting these competitive negotiations, especially if they are over the micro purchase threshold, which is, the 10 million or more. So this is not the micro purchase threshold. This is the very, very large acquisitions. And the DoD actually will look to this in addition to all of the other rules we've talked about, FARs, DFARs, AFARs, and they will actually follow the DoD's numbering convention. So we'll move to the next slide. All right, this is part 5316. This would be the types of contracts. So it talks about, the fixed price versus the cost reimbursement. It talks about incentive contracts, IDIQs, time and materials, labor hour, letter contracts, and basically the negotiation of the contract type. So it's not just a, roll the dice and pick one. There's specific factors the agency has to look at in selecting the contract type. Things like who's going to assume the risk, the government or the contractor. Are we expecting fluctuations in the supplies or the costs of materials, things like that. All of that is considered. And if you are curious as to why, a solicitation you're pursuing was assigned a certain contract type, this would be a great place to go look and make sure you agree or you understand the reasoning behind it. So that is all for my part, and I will turn it over to Kevin to talk about the rest of the AFARs.
Hi, I'm going to continue on with part 5317. This section addresses procurements that require special contracting methods. This includes things like multi-year contracting for military housing or procurements with long lead times that are covered by congressional funds that were paid in advance. The procurements also would apply to things such as the space program, and there are actually specific regulations that apply for acquisitions in the space program. And it's good for you to understand that, just to understand that if you are a contractor for the space program, that there's going to be some extra steps that may take more time. This section also has it mentions the associate contractor agreements, or ACAs. And these are agreements between contractors that are working on the Air Force contracts. They require contracts to work together, share information. There's no other relationship except they're working together, so it's not like a prime subcontractor relationship. And so a contracting officer may require contractors to have an ACA if they're working on projects together. Next slide. Parts 5326, 5328, they just deal, 5326 deals with major disasters and assistance. Basically, it's just how the Air Force will transfer the procurement activities in the event of a major disaster. Part 327 requires, the special contract clauses are required for procurements for IT services, basically data rights, patents, or copyrights. It also references what the directions are for disclosures in contracts with respect to military information that would go to foreign governments or international organizations. Then part 5328 covers bond insurance. It has a checklist for the contracting officer to determine what exactly needs to be in each contract with respect to bonds. It has an approval process to substitute out a surety bond. And it has the proof of insurance that's required for any work that's on a government installation. Another important part is the provisions with respect to overseas workers' compensation and war hazard. Basically, it has a process where a contractor can seek a waiver for workers' comp coverage and hazard insurance if they're performing services on a contract overseas. Next slide. Part 5332 discusses contract financing. There's regulations for policies for the contracting officer to advance payments for both commercial and non-commercial items. It has a process for contractors to accept requests for installment payments or deferments for contract debts. And this has come up, this situation's come up with the pandemic, with the interruption to the supply chain. You have contractors that are depending on parts that they don't have for a final product they need to deliver to get paid. And so this has a process where the contracting officer can make unusual progress payments. And then there are special things that you have to have those, get those payments processed. Next slide. Part 5339 is pretty straightforward. It just concerns how the Air Force acquires IT products and services. And again, most of it addresses the requirements for the contracting officer, but it's just important to understand that if you are a contractor that provides IT services, that it could take extra approval time because of this separate layer of regulations that are specific for the Air Force. Next slide. Part 5343 concerns contract modifications. The important part of this is that contracting officers have to assess any modification on a contract, because that's typically because any contract modification will be considered new work if that individual modification or a series of modifications when grouped together weren't contemplated when the contract was awarded or within the terms of the original contract. And what happens is if the modification is treated as new work, well, then it will require competition. Unless there's an exemption that applies. So you have to be careful when you're making the modifications. You don't want to make a modification that will have it treated as new work and then have your contract open back up for competition. And there's also a provision in this regulation that says for space program contracts that are making modifications based on engineering changes, that proposal can't be approved if the contractor is on the contractor responsibility watch list without prior approval. Next slide. This section just has to do with the termination clauses and the general termination clauses and the special termination clauses. One of the important provisions in this section is a special termination clause for some big contracts. It requires a congressional notification before those contracts can be terminated. And that is the end of those sections.
Great. Thank you guys so much for the fantastic content. Nicole, thanks again. If you want to say anything here, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It's always a pleasure, and best of luck everybody out there and dealing with the FRs. I hope we were helpful.
And Kevin, over to your contact information and any last closing words.
Well, thank you very much, and please contact us if you need any more information.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Kevin. Thanks to all the attendees who dialed in today. We will make the slides and the recording available within the next 24 hours. This was fantastic content and great to have you guys on last week and this week back to back with outstanding information. And again, if you guys have questions about the AFARs, please contact Nicole and Kevin. And hope you'll join us on Friday for doing business with the Air Force. And that concludes our webinar today.